The Vanishing. Tucked away in the northeastern United States, near the small town of Mirwell, lay a forest shrouded in perpetual mist. The locals called it the Foggy Woods, and for as long as anyone could remember, it had been the subject of dark legends. People whispered about strange sounds, eerie lights, and worst of all, disappearances. Nobody dared venture too deep. 17-year-old Jason Brooks, however, didn't believe in ghost stories. "It's just trees and fog," Jason would laugh whenever his friends brought up the woods. "You guys are scared of a little mist?" That's how it started. On a chilly October evening, Jason and 4 of his friends, Mark, Sarah, Jessica, and Ben, gathered at the edge of the forest. They carried flashlights, snacks, and phones, determined to prove the rumors wrong. "We'll go to the old wooden bridge and back," Jessica declared, gripping her flashlight tightly. "An hour tops," Ben added, though his voice wavered slightly. They entered the woods at 9 p.m., their laughter echoing through the dense trees. But as they walked deeper, the mood shifted. The usual nighttime sounds, chirping crickets, rustling leaves, faded into an unsettling silence. The fog thickened, swallowing the beams of their flashlights. "This isn't funny anymore," Sarah muttered, her voice barely audible. "Relax," Jason said. "We're almost at the bridge." When they reached the clearing, however, something was wrong. The bridge they had been looking for, a familiar, weathered wooden structure, wasn't there. Instead, they found a stone bridge, its arches ancient and covered in moss. "What the hell?" Mark murmured, staring at the unfamiliar structure. "Is this some kind of prank?" Jessica asked, her voice trembling. Jason shone his flashlight on the stones. Strange symbols were carved into them, their shapes sharp and alien. "It's just an old bridge," he said with a shrug, though even he sounded unsure. A low, distant sound broke the silence. It wasn't the wind, nor was it an animal. It was a mournful, almost human wail, faint but chilling. "Did you hear that?" Sarah whispered, clutching Ben's arm. Jason laughed nervously and stepped onto the bridge. "Jason, don't," Mark said, his voice firm. "This is a bad idea. Let's go back." Jason ignored him. He walked further onto the bridge, his flashlight cutting through the fog. "See? Nothing to be scared of," he said. But then, without warning, Jason vanished. 1 second he was there, and the next the fog consumed him. "Jason!" Mark shouted, running forward. But no matter how far they called or searched, Jason was gone. The search. The next morning, the town was buzzing with news of Jason's disappearance. Police officers, search and rescue teams, and volunteers scoured the woods. Dogs sniffed the area, drones scanned from above, and yet there was no sign of him. "We told you," Sarah sobbed to an officer. "He just disappeared. He was on the bridge and then gone." The story made no sense. Some people thought Jason had fallen into the river, but divers found no trace. Others believed the teens had gotten lost and confused by the fog. But Mark wasn't convinced. He couldn't shake the image of that stone bridge or the strange symbols etched into its surface. A week passed. The search was called off. Jason's family hung flyers and held vigils. But the hope of finding him alive began to fade. Mark, however, refused to give up. He spent hours in the library, poring over books about the woods and local history. One night, he stumbled upon an old map of Mirwell from 1892. His heart skipped a beat when he saw it. A small marker labeled "Stone Bridge, deep in the woods." Beside it was a note written in faded ink. "Gateway to nowhere." The gateway. Mark showed the map to Sarah, Jessica, and Ben. "I don't know what it means," Mark said. "But that bridge wasn't supposed to be there, and Jason's disappearance wasn't normal." "We can't go back there," Jessica said, her eyes wide. "What if it takes one of us too?" "He's still out there," Mark insisted. "I know it. That bridge, it's connected to this." Eventually, Sarah and Ben agreed to help. Armed with better flashlights, a map, and camping gear, the 3 returned to the Foggy Woods late one night. Jessica refused to join them, too terrified of what might happen. As they ventured deeper into the woods, the oppressive silence returned. The fog swirled around them like a living thing, muffling their footsteps and dampening the light from their flashlights. "It's just ahead," Mark whispered, checking the map. When they reached the clearing, the stone bridge loomed before them, exactly as they remembered it. The strange symbols glowed faintly in the dark, as if alive. "What now?" Ben asked, his voice shaking. Mark stepped onto the bridge, his heart pounding. Nothing happened. He walked further, waving his flashlight over the symbols. "Jason!" he shouted into the fog. The air grew colder. A faint whisper seemed to drift toward them, a wordless sound that made their skin crawl. Suddenly, the ground beneath them trembled, and the symbols on the bridge flared with light. "We need to get off," Sarah screamed, grabbing Ben's arm. But Mark stood frozen as the fog thickened, swirling like a vortex. For a split second, he saw something in the mist, a figure reaching out. It was Jason. "Jason!" Mark shouted, running toward the figure. But as he did, the light from the symbols surged, and everything went black. Should I continue with what happens to Mark and his friends, or focus on Jason's experience after he disappeared? Into the unknown. When Mark opened his eyes, he was no longer in the woods. The air was thick and heavy, the light dim and gray, as though the world were shrouded in an eternal twilight. Around him stretched an endless expanse of twisted trees with blackened bark, their branches clawing at the sky. "Sarah?"
"Ben!"
Mark called out, his voice echoing unnaturally in the stillness. No response. He turned in circles, trying to get his bearings, but nothing looked familiar. Then he noticed the stone bridge behind him, or rather, what remained of it. The bridge was broken, its stones scattered as if blasted apart. "Where am I?" he muttered to himself. The symbols on the stones still glowed faintly, pulsating like a heartbeat. Mark knelt to touch one, and a sharp pain shot through his hand. He recoiled, noticing his palm was now marked with one of the strange symbols, burned into his skin like a brand. Before he could process this, he heard footsteps. "Mark!" The voice was faint but unmistakable. It was Jason. "Jason, where are you?" Mark shouted, spinning around. A shadow moved in the distance, weaving between the blackened trees. Mark chased it, stumbling over roots and rocks. As he ran, the world around him seemed to shift. The trees bent and twisted, their forms warping like reflections in a funhouse mirror. The air grew colder, and the distant wails he'd heard before returned, louder this time and closer. Finally, he reached a clearing. In the center stood Jason. "Jason!" Mark cried, rushing toward him. But something was wrong. Jason's back was turned, his body unnaturally still. "Jason?" Mark asked, his voice trembling. Slowly, Jason turned around. His eyes were black voids, and his face was pale as ash. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. Only a low, guttural groan. Mark stumbled backward as Jason began to move toward him, his movements jerky and unnatural. "Stay back!" Mark yelled, but Jason kept coming. Just as Jason reached for him, a blinding light erupted from the ground. The symbols on Mark's palm flared with heat, and a force slammed into him, throwing him to the ground. When he looked up, Jason was gone. The Watcher. Mark lay there, gasping for air, when a new presence made itself known. A tall figure emerged from the shadows, cloaked in black. Its face was obscured by a hood, but its eyes glowed faintly, like embers in the dark. "You should not be here," the figure said, its voice deep and resonant. "Who are you?" Mark demanded, scrambling to his feet. "Where's Jason?" The figure tilted its head. "Your friend has crossed into the threshold. Few return from there." "The threshold?" Mark asked, his voice shaking. "What is this place?" The figure gestured to the twisted forest around them. "This is the Between, a place where time and space unravel. You came through the gate." Mark clenched his fists. "I didn't come here by choice. Jason disappeared, and I'm trying to find him." The figure's eyes narrowed. "If you wish to save your friend, you must move quickly." The threshold is not forgiving. But beware. The way forward demands a price. What price? You'll see, the figure said cryptically, turned and began walking into the forest. Follow if you wish to live. With no other options, Mark followed. The threshold. The figure led Mark through the warped landscape, its movements eerily graceful. As they walked, the figure explained, the gate you crossed was a relic of the old ones, beings who once ruled the spaces between worlds. They left long ago, but their creations remain, trapping the unwary. Why did it take Jason? Mark asked. Some gates are dormant, others awake. Your friend was unfortunate enough to trigger this one. The gate has bound him to this realm. Can I get him back? The figure stopped and turned to face Mark. Perhaps, but the threshold feeds on fear, regret, and guilt. If you are not careful, it will consume you as well. Mark swallowed hard. He could feel the weight of the figure's words pressing down on him. They reached the edge of a vast chasm, where the ground split apart, revealing a glowing void below. Floating stones formed a precarious path across the chasm, and on the other side stood a massive, looming gate made of black stone. Its surface was covered in the same glowing symbols as the bridge. He is beyond that gate, the figure said. Mark hesitated. What happens if I fail? The figure's glowing eyes burned brighter. You will join the lost. Now go. Taking a deep breath, Mark stepped onto the first stone, facing the fear. The path was unstable, the stones shifting and crumbling beneath Mark's feet. As he crossed, the wails grew louder, joined by whispers that seemed to come from inside his own mind. It's your fault he's gone. You shouldn't have let him go on the bridge. You'll never save him. Mark gritted his teeth, forcing himself to focus. None of this is real, he muttered. When he reached the final stone, the whispers stopped. He stood before the black gate, its symbols glowing ominously. He pressed his branded palm against the surface, and the gate shuddered, slowly creaking open. Beyond it was a dark void, and at its center was Jason, suspended in the air. Tendrils of shadow wrapped around him, pulsating like living things. Jason! Mark yelled, running toward him. As he reached out, the shadows lashed at him, slicing into his skin. The symbols on his palm burned again, and the shadows recoiled. Mark grabbed Jason's arm, pulling with all his strength. The shadows screamed, their wails deafening. The ground beneath them began to crumble, and the void expanded, threatening to swallow them both. With one final effort, Mark yanked Jason free, and the two of them tumbled backward through the gate. The fog follows. Mark forced Jason to leave. Go while you can, Mark said, staring directly into his friend's eyes. I don't know how this works, but I can feel it. If you stay, this place will take you. Go back to the town. I can't leave you here, Jason protested. But Mark only shook his head. You have a choice. I don't. Jason hesitated, standing frozen as though about to turn back. But the shadows spilling from the gate forced him to move. With a heavy heart, he ran back into the foggy forest. Mark's sacrifice. Mark stood before the gate, feeling its pull grow stronger. The symbol on his palm burned, its heat searing into his skin like a living flame. Behind him, the stone bridge was crumbling, each piece falling into the abyss below. The gate began to close again, but the shadows from the other side didn't stop. We'll meet again, Mark whispered, before stepping into the dense fog. Jason's return. When Jason emerged from the woods, it was morning. The fog began to lift, and he felt the warmth of the sun on his skin. The forest looked ordinary now. No shadows, no gates, no bridge. But as he walked back to town, something felt wrong. When he arrived at his house, it was eerily silent. His mother, who always waited for him with a steaming cup of tea, didn't open the door. The entire town seemed too quiet, almost empty. Then he saw it. The fog was creeping toward his home. Jason stepped inside, his heart pounding, and froze in his room. Carved into the wall was the same symbol that had been on Mark's palm. Mark, Jason whispered, His voice echoed, but not in the room, in his head. "I'm here, Jason. The gate isn't closed." The fog began seeping into every crack, filling the room. Jason looked at the mirror on the wall. At first, it was just fog swirling in the reflection. Then Mark's shadowy figure appeared. His eyes were black voids, and the symbol on his palm glowed like a warning. "You should have left." Mark's voice was deep and distant, as though it came from another dimension. "Now everything is different. They know about our world." Jason couldn't move. The fog filled every corner of the room until all he could see was white. Epilogue. Over time, the foggy woods around the town began to expand. More and more people went missing, just like Jason had once vanished. The town earned a new nickname, the City of Mist. Locals began to whisper about seeing figures in mirrors or shadows moving in the fog outside their homes. Those who dared to venture too close to the forest edge said they felt watched by black eyes and glowing symbols. "The fog follows," they warned, "and if you got too close to its borders, you would never come back." Please don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel, because that's what inspires me to write interesting stories for you. Share in the comments why you listened to this story to the end, write what you wanted to hear the next story about.